Welcome back to the Click Down. I'm Steve Beals, your host, and I'm back for another exciting episode of All Things Citrix. Today, we're going to be talking about Citrix Resiliency and the features that Citrix provides to give you a highly available deployment. I'm being joined today by Isaac Stasevich, a senior product manager here at Citrix. Isaac, welcome to the Click Down.
Awesome. Glad to be here. Thanks for having me.
So I have a bunch of questions for you. And before we get started and before I really start peppering you with those questions, can you tell our audience a little bit about yourself and your role here at Citrix?
Yeah, so my name's Isaac Stasevich. I've been at Citrix for about 5 years now. Started a good portion of my career with the consulting organization, so going to different customers across different verticals, mostly large enterprise customers, including healthcare, finance, education, really all over the place there. And then recently I settled on a position in product management. So in my position now, I'm really focusing on everything resiliency, local host cache, service continuity, and just kind of keeping my eye on our uptime in cloud and keeping things running smoothly.
Awesome. Yeah, it's funny. I keep obviously having guests on the podcast, and they just so happen to all have like a consulting background, including myself.
I was about to say, I heard you had a consulting.
I know. So it's funny, like, you know, it's not by it's just happen chance. Let's just say that it's not something planned. But there's a lot of former consultants within different roles at Citrix, so I think it just shows that the consulting organization was strong as it was built out. So you mentioned a couple of things that we're going to be talking about today, and that's great. So, you know, we're going to dive into the two main features, really, when we talk about Citrix Resiliency, and that's the local host cache, which is obviously primarily for on-premises virtual apps and desktops deployments, and service continuity, which is, you know, really helping our Citrix DaaS customers. So I guess my first question for you is, can you explain a bit about how local host cache and service continuity work?
Yeah, absolutely. And one thing I want to clarify there is actually with DaaS as well, we can use localhost cache. So localhost cache comes into play for both on-prem and cloud deployments. And localhost cache is going to use a locally cached copy of the DaaS or CVAD site configuration to provide connectivity if we lose connectivity to SQL or DaaS. So it's going to keep our end users launching if we lose that connectivity to the main site database. So when we go into localhost cache, there's a couple of things that could happen. If you're in DaaS and you still have access to Studio, what you'll see when you go into localhost cache is all your VDAs are going to become unregistered. For on-prem, if we go into localhost cache, we'll actually see that we can't use the Studio console. So what's going to happen here is our VDAs are going to re-register with a secondary broker service on either our delivery controllers or connectors. And that's going to provide our end users access to those resources, even if we don't have access to SQL or we don't have connectivity with DaaS. So the whole point here is keep our end users launching. So we locally cache that copy of the CVAD or DaaS site configurations on that delivery controller or connector. That awesome. Clear on that one, Steve?
That's perfectly clear. Yeah. I think, you know, for our customers, you know, it's funny when I've gone around and talked to customers, localhost cache has obviously been around for a while. It's something that I think customers rely on. Service continuity, obviously it was new. So, you know, a lot of customers didn't know about it and the word's getting out there about that. But obviously bringing any resilience to a Citrix environment is, you know, top of mind for really any Citrix administrator, right? So when we talk about, you know, improving resiliency, what do you think the best way to improve resiliency in either virtual apps and desktops or Citrix DaaS environment is?
So Steve, if you don't mind, before we hop into that one, I did want to get a little bit into what service continuity is and how it works.
Perfect.
On that side. Yeah. So service continuity is going to leverage what we call our connection leasing technology. And what that's going to do is it's going to cache apps and desktops that a user has available to them on their actual endpoint. So there were some previous iterations of connection leasing technology, I believe with like 7.6, where you had to have actually launched the app or desktop to get access to them. With service continuity, that's not the case. So as soon as a user logs in, we're going to get our apps and desktops enumerated to our workspace app or to our browser. So service continuity is going to cache those resources that we have available to us. as a set of files in our profile there. So these files are going to be completely encrypted. They're going to be tamper-proof. We're not going to be able to move them from endpoint to endpoint. They're going to be, specific to that user on that device. And then if there's any issues speaking to the workspace service or speaking to our IDP, or if there's a DaaS issue, we're going to use those cached resources to enumerate the applications on our endpoint, and then use those connection lease files. They're going to have some information that'll help us get to our resource location and try to launch those apps and desktops there. Could actually even use that localhost cache database. So service continuity can be used in conjunction with localhost cache. So kind of important to know how they work together in that sense.
Okay, awesome. Quick question as you were talking about the connection lease files. If I'm a customer and I go into outage mode and those leases come into play, what happens after things are restored? Do those connection lease files do they remain on the endpoints? What's the process there?
Yeah, so the connection lease files are going to have a duration for how long they're valid for. And they're going to refresh about every time the user logs in and at a regular interval there. So they will remain on the endpoint. So if you go into outage, you launch during an outage, you come back online, things are working normally, we're going to maintain those lease files on the device. Just in case we have another outage, we'll be able to continue to use those lease files.
All right, makes sense. So now we'll go back to my improvement question. So what is the best way for customers to improve resiliency in their environments?
Yeah, so one big thing we're actually really excited about that we just released is something we're calling misconfiguration alerts. So what we're doing is we're exposing errors and warnings in our Studio console that's going to let our customers know if there are misconfigurations in the environment. So you can see these misconfigurations either in your home node. There's going to be a little flag at the top right. This is a cloud only for the time being. We're looking at moving this to on-prem in the near future as well. But if you are a cloud customer, you can look in the top right. You'll see a little flag. Or you can go into your zones node. If you go into zones, you'll see the different resource locations that may have a misconfiguration, and reviewing that and making sure your environment is optimally configured is really the best way to ensure that you can use localhost cache correctly. That if we have a localhost cache event, things are going to continue to launch smoothly. Some other really common misconfigurations that we see, making sure your connectors are sized properly. So at least 6 gigabytes of RAM on your connectors would be a really good thing to double check and make sure. Another one that, coming from my consulting days, we did a ton of infrastructure assessments, we would call them. And one of the most common things we would see is not enough vCPU cores per socket on your connectors or your delivery controllers. So when we go into a localhost cache, localhost cache event, we're using a locally cached copy of the site configurations on that connector or delivery controller. And that locally cached copy is going to be confined to using a single socket. So if we're using one vCPU core per socket, and it doesn't really matter how many vCPUs we have on that, we're constrained to only one. Mm-hmm. So definitely recommend 4 cores per socket when you're configuring your delivery controllers or your cloud connectors. Another couple common ones are storefront advanced health checks. As we've improved our product for resiliency, a big one that's coming out is storefront advanced health checks. As of 2309, that's going to be on by default in storefront. But if you're in a version before that, I definitely recommend reviewing that configuration and making sure that's configured across your storefront servers. That storefront advanced health check is on your storefront servers, just to make sure that's good.
Awesome.
Yeah, so there's a few other big ones. There's a setting we have in localhost cache that's called reuse machines without shutdown and outage. Have you heard of that one, Steve?
I have not, actually.
Yeah, and we see that some people haven't heard of this before. But when we look at power managed pooled desktops, by default, those actually aren't available when we go into localhost cache. The reason being for that is because we don't have access to hosting connections when we go into localhost cache. So we can't send out power actions. So when we have a non-persistent power managed pooled desktop, we can't reset the disk during localhost cache. So what this setting is going to allow us to do is it's going to allow us to reuse that VDA without the disk being reset. So you'll have subsequent users on a VDA that has been used before, which isn't the normal operations of a pooled desktop. But it's going to maintain that access during a localhost cache event. So really important one there if you have a lot of non-persistent, power-managed pooled desktops in your environment, looking into that reused machines with that shutdown and outage setting, super important. And then the last one here, Steve, I've been going on this one, but
no, this is great. Yeah.
Yeah. Whenever we talk about DR, or we talk about high availability, these features don't have the same value if you are not consistently testing these features at a regular interval, right? Any type of DR process, any type of HA should always be tested for failover. So we really want to recommend our customers have some type of regular cadence in which they go in and test that localhost cache or service continuity in their environment and make sure it's working as expected.
All right, great. So a couple things I've pulled from there. One, we definitely seem like we're trying to make it easier for resiliency, right? By having some of these things on by default, right? Which I think is great.
Absolutely.
Two, I kind of always feel that there are settings though that, you asked me a question. Do you know about this setting? No, there's always that one or two settings that help with something that maybe customers don't know about. So yeah, I mean, getting that information out there, making sure the things we have on Tech Zone are updated. So that's always big. And then the third thing is, definitely from the consulting days too, right? Test your DR plan. I felt like when I was in consulting and we would do infrastructure assessments, I think that was like a top recommendation for everyone I ever did, because you bring up that question, are you testing this? Are you testing your DR plans? Are you testing, if you have an outage? And most of the time the answers were no. So, I mean, all great advice there. So that's perfect. So, I actually remember, not that it was that long ago, but I do remember when DaaS was first introduced. And then, obviously it wasn't called DaaS back then, but when that DaaS service was first introduced and customers started adopting the service, and there was always the question about, hey, is the service resilient? How, what happens if the service goes down? And always the two big questions I was asked was, what happens if the service isn't available for me, or is there going to be a local host cache feature for that service? And then when we introduced service continuity, it was a game changer, right? Because, we put something in place that kind of put a lot of these questions at ease. So it's now been a few years since we've introduced service continuity. And, so my question is, what has changed within the feature since then?
Yeah, absolutely. So for service continuity, they're, always working. We're hearing a lot of, talking to customers all the time about it and what we want to improve. So one big thing that we've changed in recent years, and I would say the biggest one that I've still had some customers that, kind of similar theme that didn't know it was available, is browser support, right? And this was a huge one in terms of coming up to par with, coming up on the same level as localhost cache's resiliency feature. So now with browser support, you can install a browser plugin on your device and maintain that access, maintain that offline mode access if there's any connectivity issues between your endpoint and the workspace, or any DaaS issues. So browser support is a big one. Another big one is iGel support. As I talk to customers, iGel is growing more and more, and we're seeing a lot of customers moving to thin clients and those kinds of devices, and iGel support. We're really excited to be announcing that we support that. There's also some other things. We're overcoming more outage scenarios. If we ever hear that there's something that service continuity didn't kick in for, we are overcoming those very quickly. We can now control delivery group level, right? If there's one delivery group we want service continuity on for and another one that we don't, that's a big one there. And then another really important one I feel is app protection support. So if you're using app protection in your environment, service continuity will continue to honor those app protection policies that you have set. So, and then the last one here is coming up in the near future. We're doing a lot of stuff with Azure AD joined or Entra joined devices and non-domain joined devices that we have coming in the near future that we're really excited to be releasing soon.
Awesome. Yeah. So really covering the whole gamut of, devices and scenarios that we have, which really has come a long way. I mean, when service continuity was introduced, it was Windows, right? And,
Yeah.
so seeing that is great because it's obviously such a great feature. So what about some recommendations maybe for customers who are using service continuity today? Is there any recommendations that you have for them?
Yeah. So the first one is, and my personal, every customer is going to be a little bit different on this one, but my personal preference, I wouldn't put the lease duration to less than 7 days on these for these connection lease files. So what you'll see is, when end users will log in, if they have a long weekend, if they're out Thursday or Friday, and we come back on Monday, and there's some type of issue with internet or issue with any type of connectivity with the endpoint in Citrix Cloud or Citrix Workspace, we want to make sure those lease files are still on the device and still valid, right? So still valid on the device. So lowering that value from 7 days can get a little bit tricky when we have some users that may not be in on Thursdays or Fridays, or, so I would keep that lease duration to 7 days. I would consider making it longer. The longer we have it, the more availability we have for our end users. And then the next one is, kind of back to what we were talking earlier and back to your infrastructure assessment days, is just making sure we're continuing to test this.
Right.
One really easy way to test the feature is if you go to an endpoint and go to the host file on that endpoint and put a dummy, host file entry for the workspace URL, you'll be able to trigger that offline mode because your endpoint will think that it can't get to that workspace URL. So that's a really easy way to test. Like, I would highly recommend that we test this feature and make sure we use the results of that test to educate our end users on what that behavior is and how they should be interacting with the product.
Yeah, that piece is so easy too. I mean, I do that all the time. Obviously content creation, right? So we're having to create videos to show these features and service continuity. That's, one of the easiest things for us to do is to show an outage. I'm a remote worker, so how am I going to show an outage on something when it's, me here? That's an easy way to do that. So being able to test something like that is super simple.
Yeah, as we kind of come out with like new features and everything, or as I'm working with engineering, that's always the first thing I do. So it takes about all the 5 minutes to test.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. What about any limits? Yeah, no, go ahead.
Is definitely making sure we're pushing out that browser extension. Browser extension is actually going to increase security because the ICA file is going to be on the memory of the device rather than downloaded. Well, it's going to be downloaded either way, but not on your file system. It's going to stay in memory. So it's kind of a security feature there, as well as giving you that service continuity on your browser. So really big feature in the browser extension there that I'd recommend all customers look into.
Okay. And this is kind of going to be probably a follow-up to this as well, about the browser extension. So I'll ask that one first and then follow it up with the other thing. So what browsers today do we support?
So Chrome, Safari, and Edge are going to be the big ones. And the big one missing there that they're always working towards improving on is going to be Firefox there.
Okay, perfect. So, and what about any other limitations with service continuity? I mean, so we know, Firefox is I hate the word limitation. It is a limitation, right? We aren't supporting Firefox. Maybe it's something that's coming down the road. But what other scenarios are there where service continuity won't work?
So I'd say one of the biggest challenges for service continuity is going to be kiosk devices. So we need to have an end user that has logged into the device before to generate those lease files. So for some of these kiosk devices, if you don't know the user has logged into that device before, what we can see is that we'll lose those. We won't have those lease files on it. So if you know that the user is going to the same kiosk device every day, we can maintain that lease file on that kiosk device. If your users are switching around desks, we may not have the lease file on that device, and we lose the benefits of service continuity.
Right.
So I would say that's the one that we're kind of heads down focused on trying to figure out the most is going to be these kiosk scenarios. But at the moment, that's going to be one of the ones that we might recommend using on-prem storefront for and using localhost cache for those kinds of use cases rather than workspace. So some other ones, On-prem site aggregation, we don't currently have support for. That's another one we're looking at heads down as we're kind of moving to destination hybrid and really pushing the hybrid story. That's another one that's top of mind. So if you're aggregating on-prem resources to your workspace platform, we don't have service continuity support for those on-prem resources. We could still use service continuity for the cloud resources that are delivered through Workspace there. If you're using an on-prem gateway for HDX proxy, right? So you're using a NetScaler for HDX proxy rather than our gateway service. We also don't have support for service continuity there. And then last is going to be device posture service. That's the one that we're also looking at there.
Okay. Awesome. So definitely some things we're still working on, but sounds like there's a lot of work being done to resolve even more of the issues that are out there. But that's great to hear.
Oh yeah, we got engineering teams working hard.
Yeah, good to hear. Good to hear. So I want to give some love to our local host cache customers as well, our on-premises customers who we know are primarily using local host cache. So what's are there any new features or what's new with local host cache recently?
Yeah, so with local host cache, a big one that I mentioned earlier was going to be the misconfigurations, errors, and warnings that we're exposing in the zones and the home nodes of. This is just going to be for DaaS, right? And
yep.
Steve, you mentioned on-prem again there. I just want to make sure it's clear that.
Yeah, I keep doing that. That's the old school in me, going back to those days. So.
Yeah, so we can use localhost cache with DaaS and an on-prem storefront there. So the misconfiguration alerts, the reason why I brought that up is misconfiguration alerts is only going to be a DaaS feature for now, as we're looking to move that on-prem in the future. So yeah, so those are really great. I would definitely recommend reviewing that in your environment and making sure that your environment is up to date and no incorrect configurations there. Another new one that I'm actually really excited about, and it's kind of one of our main themes that we're looking at in localhost cache, is we're improving logging on our connectors. This is for both on-prem and DaaS. We have these new event IDs on our connectors during a localhost cache event. That'll be 3507, 3508, 3509, and 3510. And those events on our connectors or delivery controllers are going to give you some really critical information about how localhost cache is working in your environment. If we have successful launches, if our VDAs are registering connect correctly during localhost cache. So before this, we don't have a lot of visibility into what's going on during a localhost cache event, right? We go into localhost cache, we can't see our VDAs registered, we have no idea if our users are launching or not. We're kind of relying on support tickets to know, how well is this working or not. With this improved logging, it's going to give you the following information. It's going to give you how long you've been in localhost cache for. It's going to tell you how many users have launched sessions during this localhost cache event. And it's going to tell you how many of your VDAs are registered. So really improve that visibility and gain an understanding of how our environment is responding to this issue in our environment and how our users are being impacted by it. Or hopefully not impacted by it, right?
Not impacted by it, right? Exactly.
Yeah, and then the last one there is we are also we're trying to just make things easier on the localhost cache side. So we've introduced some PowerShell commandlets that you can use to switch some settings with localhost cache, and that forced outage mode. We have a forced outage mode where you can go into the registry and change a registry and turn on localhost cache. We've made that available using a PowerShell commandlet to make it a little bit easier, not remember exactly the reg key that you have to find.
Yeah.
Go on a mad Google Dash to find out which reg key it is.
Exactly. All right. Awesome. So you've mentioned misconfiguration alerts a few times. Can you dive a bit deeper into what alerts we're actually currently exposing?
Yeah. So this one we're growing every day. Kind of, it's always top of mind. So one of the biggest things we see with support cases when it comes to localhost cache is we go and review our customers' environments, and we'll find that there might be something that we can tweak that can improve the performance. So on this first iteration of the feature, the things that we're exposing are only a single connector in a resource location, right? We recommend multiple connectors in every resource location for high availability purposes. If your resource location contains multiple domains, that could affect the way things work while in localhost cache. If your cloud connectors are undersized, they don't have enough vCPU allocated to it. When we go into localhost cache, we're running off a single connector or single delivery controller. So sizing appropriately to make sure that we could handle the load of all of our VDAs on one connector or delivery controller is super important there. Too many VDAs in a resource location or a site, kind of just in that same theme. When we go into localhost cache, we all the VDAs register with a single delivery controller or cloud connector. So if you have too many VDAs, it could impact the performance of a localhost cache event. So making sure we're under that, I think it's 10,000 per resource location threshold is super important. And then last, another thing that could affect the performance of the environment is having too many hosting connections in a site. So it's important to kind of review the limits that we have in DaaS and make sure we're under those and not exceeding those.
Awesome.
So in the future, we're looking at adding more, right? More about connector sizing, right? The sockets, the memory, all of that. We really want to make sure we're sized appropriately. And then in the near future, we're going to be able to expose from Studio in DaaS if your resource location is in localhost cache or not, which we're really excited about.
Awesome. So I love that you mentioned the future, because obviously everyone always loves to hear, hey, what's coming? What's on the roadmap? So is there anything else that, for both service continuity and localhost cache that, we're working on for future releases?
Yeah, absolutely. So we have some themes that we're really looking to improve on in both of those features. So when we look at localhost cache, we want to improve visibility, right? We have those monitoring events. We want our administrators to understand what's going on during these localhost cache events so they can tweak their environment, or go to their higher ups and say, look how great we did. We're continuing to run during these issues. So being able to provide that visibility and understanding standing in their environment during the localhost cache event is top of mind for us. Another thing is the proactive notifications, right? Those misconfiguration errors and warnings that we're really looking at enhancing and improving on. We want to tell administrators proactively before an issue pops up to make sure things continue to run smoothly. And then last, when it comes to localhost caches, we're always looking at improving the performance and availability of our resources. So how can we make sure that localhost cache has as little of an impact to our environment as possible is really always what we're looking at on that side. When it comes to
end users running, right? Keep those end users running, keep them going, right? No, yeah, exactly.
And then when we're looking at service continuity, we're looking at just to continue to drive parity and support more and more use cases on that side, right? The kiosk devices are a big one. Any kind of anything that we still have dangling out there that we don't support, we're definitely looking at improving on. Another one, similar in the localhost cache that we were talking about, is improving visibility, right? We want to be able to troubleshoot this feature. We want to be able to understand how it's helping our environment. To really show the value of the feature and show how we're keeping our end users going. And then overall, just improving experience, right? As we continue to go, we're looking at tweaking the user experience for this one and making sure it's as good as it could possibly be.
Awesome. I feel like we could talk about like Citrix Resiliency and local, like all these features like all day, but we can't. We're running right up on time. So I'm sure I'm going to have you back on future as we continue to make improvements here. So obviously, welcome back anytime, because this great conversation. This is, I think something that, because we're doing so much work, is going to be something we're going to definitely want to keep our customers updated on. But I really appreciate you joining me today. It was a great conversation.
Appreciate you having me, Steve. It was great chatting with you.
Yeah. So for everyone else, it was, it's great to hear that we continue working towards making, our Citrix products more resilient to any sort of failure. If you're interested in any more information and details, please visit Citrix Tech Zone. And, we have a number of tech papers and videos out there that cover both localhost cache and service continuity. And with that, thanks for joining us today. Until next time, this has been the Click Down.